Smoke curls upward from the great ziggurat of Babylon, thick with the scent of burning resin. Inside, shadows flicker against gilded walls as chants rise in the tongue of the gods. At the center stands a woman, bare, adorned with little more than gold chains, offered not to a mortal, but to the empire itself. Witnesses whisper that this ritual, sanctioned by the Nebuchadnezzar court, blurred the line between worship and degradation. This is the Babylon you do not read about in schoolbooks. Behind the towering gates and lush hanging gardens lay chambers, where desire and divinity intertwined in ways both mesmerizing and horrific. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who ruled the ancient world's most dazzling city, was more than a conqueror. He was a master of control, of nations, of faith, and of flesh. In his harem, concubines were not merely companions. They were instruments of politics, vessels of ritual, and victims of power. Rumors of sacred prostitution, forced fertility rites, and humiliating tests of loyalty swirled through ancient accounts, painting Babylon as both glorious and damned. Tonight, we enter those hidden chambers, and what you will discover may forever change the way you see the ancient world. In ancient empires, the bedchamber was often as powerful as the battlefield. For Nebuchadnezzar II, whose armies had shattered Jerusalem and dragged its people into captivity, conquest was not complete when walls fell. It extended into the private lives of his subjects, their wives, their daughters, and even their gods. The greatest kings of Mesopotamia understood that sexuality was more than desire. It was a weapon, a ritual, and a theater of domination. The king as living god to the Babylonians. The king stood as the chosen of Marduk, the divine authority on earth. Yet this power was not displayed solely in temples or carved in stone reliefs. It was enacted in the most intimate of ways. During the annual New Year's festival, Nebuchadnezzar was said to participate in the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage rite, in which he embodied the god and a high priestess represented the goddess Ishtar. What appeared to outsiders as a divine ceremony was, at its core, a sexual act elevated to cosmic importance. Desire itself was ritualized, and the body of the king became the battlefield upon which fertility and political legitimacy were performed. But behind the pageantry lurked a darker truth. If the king was the god incarnate, then those offered to him, priestesses, concubines, slaves, were expected to submit not just to a ruler, but to the divine. Consent, as we understand it today, had no place here. To resist the king's advances was to defy the gods themselves. The harem as prison and palace. Nebuchadnezzar maintained vast harems filled with women from across his conquered territories. Some were gifts from noble families seeking favor. Others were captives, torn from their homelands and thrust into a gilded prison. These women were dressed in silks, adorned with jewels, and fed exotic foods. But beneath the luxury lay chains of servitude. The harem was more than a collection of lovers. It was a political institution. By bedding women from defeated nations, Nebuchadnezzar symbolically absorbed their lands into his body. Each concubine was a living reminder of Babylon's dominance, her intimacy with the king transforming her into both trophy and hostage. Should her people rebel, her life and the lives of her children hung in the balance. Whispers tell of brutal competitions within the harem. Women, desperate for the king's favor, were said to endure humiliating tests of loyalty. Some accounts, though shrouded in speculation, speak of nights where concubines were paraded before priests and officials, their bodies inspected like cattle, their obedience measured in silence and submission. Those who failed to please were cast aside, their once privileged lives reduced to slavery. Sexuality as a language of power. For Nebuchadnezzar, intimacy was never merely private. Every act carried symbolic weight. To embrace a concubine was to remind his court of his potency, his divine mandate, his unchallengeable supremacy. The king's body became a stage where politics, religion, and desire converged. In Babylon, as in much of the ancient world, women were vessels of lineage and property. A concubine who bore the king's child could rise to near royal status. Yet this ascent came at a cost: constant vigilance, rivalry, and fear of betrayal. Poisonings, strangulations, and disappearances plagued the inner chambers. Desire was both a ladder and a noose. The psychology of control, modern psychology, helps us understand what may have unfolded behind those palace walls. The transformation of sex into ritual and spectacle served a dual purpose. It bound the king's subjects in awe, and it shattered the autonomy of those who served him. For the women of his court, intimacy was stripped of personal meaning and reshaped into a tool of empire. Their bodies became texts upon which Nebuchadnezzar inscribed his power. This dynamic reveals a chilling truth about human societies. The more absolute the ruler, the more intimate the mechanisms of control. Sexuality, normally a realm of personal choice, was in Babylon a matter of state policy, weaponized to reinforce hierarchies and silence dissent, taboos and social norms. For the common Babylonian, sexuality followed strict codes. Marriage contracts defined obligations, fidelity was demanded, and adultery could bring death. Yet at the top, in the royal court, the same culture that punished ordinary men and women for transgression allowed the king to indulge in forbidden rites. The double standard was stark. What was sin for the people was sanctified for the ruler. This contradiction haunted Babylonian society. To outsiders, the city gleamed with wealth and sacred order. But for those who lived in its shadow, the palace represented a place where divine law could be twisted to justify the most intimate of degradations. In Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, desire was not a private hunger, it was an empire's heartbeat. The king wielded sexuality like a scepter, binding priesthoods, bending nobles, and breaking the will of conquered peoples. And for the concubines, who lived within those towering walls, every night carried the weight of politics, ritual, and terror. But as we shall see, this use of intimacy as power was not without consequences. For when desire and control intertwined too tightly, scandal was never far behind. And in Babylon, the whispers of scandal were enough to shake the foundations of the empire itself. Among the most controversial claims about Babylon comes from the Greek historian Herodotus. Writing a century after Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he described a shocking practice said to take place in the city's grandest temple. Every woman, at least once in her life, was required to sit within the sacred precinct of Ishtar's shrine and offer herself to a stranger. Only when the ritual was complete, he claimed, was she purified and permitted to return to her family. Modern scholars debate the truth of this account. Some argue Herodotus exaggerated or misunderstood Babylonian rituals. Others suggest he conflated rumors with reality, building upon the empire's reputation for decadence. Yet for our purposes, the power of this claim lies not in its certainty, but in the scandal it ignited. To outsiders, especially Greeks and later Judeans, such practices confirmed Babylon's image as the embodiment of sin. And within Nebuchadnezzar's own court, where temple and palace were often entwined, such rumors may have been fueled by real, if secretive, spectacles. The scandal of the concubines, Nebuchadnezzar's harem, was not merely a household. It was an institution that demanded obedience, secrecy, and ritual performance. Here, behind guarded gates, the king's concubines lived lives of luxury, chained to constant fear. The scandal that erupted within those walls was whispered about for centuries, though no single written account survives in full. Instead, fragments from Hebrew texts, Greek chronicles, and Babylonian myths point to a story of ritualized intimacy turned grotesque. One tale suggests that during the sacred marriage rites of the New Year's festival, Nebuchadnezzar did not limit himself to a single priestess representing Ishtar. Instead, multiple concubines were forced to reenact the goddess's union with the divine king. What had been a solemn ceremony became a theater of excess, with women compelled to compete for favor under the watchful eyes of priests and officials. Some were paraded naked, crowned with symbolic headdresses, and made to perform fertility dances before the king and his court. Others were chosen for the ultimate role, lying with the king, not in private chambers, but as part of a staged rite witnessed by high-ranking elites. For the concubines, this was not an act of devotion. It was survival. Refusal meant exile or death. The human cost to grasp the horror of such a scandal, one must consider the human beings trapped within it. Many of these women were foreigners, captured during Nebuchadnezzar's conquests. Judean, Phoenician, and Egyptian girls were taken as spoils of war, severed from their families, and thrust into a world where their value was measured by beauty and obedience. Imagine a young woman from Jerusalem, dragged into Babylon after the destruction of her city in 587 BCE. She had seen her temple burned, her family slain or enslaved, and now she was brought into the very palace of the conqueror. To resist his demands was unthinkable. To comply was to betray her memories, her gods, her identity. And yet, survival demanded submission. Such stories, though rarely preserved in stone or text, live on in the silences between the lines of history. The scandal, then, was not a single event, but a series of acts that accumulated into a reputation. Babylon's concubines were rumored to be not just lovers, but sacrificial offerings, tools through which the king affirmed his divine role. Their humiliation was woven into the empire's pageantry. The shockwaves of rumor news of these practices did not remain confined to Babylon's walls. Traders carried whispers along caravan routes. Envoys repeated them in foreign courts. To outsiders, these rumors confirmed what many already believed: that Babylon was a city of sin, where morality had been drowned in gold and incense. For the Hebrew prophets, such stories became a weapon. In the book of Daniel and later texts, Babylon is portrayed as the archetype of corruption. The imagery of the whore of Babylon in Christian scripture draws directly from these scandalous accounts, transforming political enmity into sexualized metaphor. Babylon's women, whether concubines, priestesses, or imagined harlots, became symbols of the empire's depravity. Even the Persians, who eventually conquered Babylon, propagated tales of the city's excess. To them, Babylon's fall was not merely a military victory, but a moral one, a cleansing of a decadent court consumed by its own desires. Character, motivations, and stakes. But why would Nebuchadnezzar allow or even encourage such scandalous practices? To answer this, we must understand the psychology of kingship in Mesopotamia. Power in Babylon was inseparable from divine legitimacy. The king's virility was seen as a reflection of the god's favor. By staging public or semi-public sexual rituals, Nebuchadnezzar transformed private acts into political statements. Each concubine's submission became a symbol of conquered peoples submitting to Babylon. For the concubines themselves, the stakes could not have been higher. To please the king might mean elevation, wealth, and survival. To fail was to invite disgrace, punishment, or execution. Rivalries between women fueled further cruelty, as each sought to outshine the others in ritual, performance. The priests too had their role. By overseeing and sanctifying these acts, they reinforced the illusion that this was not depravity, but devotion. Yet behind the masks of ritual, the human cost remained staggering. The aftermath scandal, however, has consequences. Even if Nebuchadnezzar's excesses strengthened his immediate image as a divine ruler, they also sowed seeds of resentment. Subjects whispered about the king's cruelty. Conquered peoples seethed at the humiliation of their daughters. Prophets denounced Babylon as a city doomed to divine wrath. When Cyrus the Great captured Babylon in 539 BCE, he entered the city without a fight. Some scholars suggest this bloodless conquest was made possible by the disillusionment of Babylon's own people. Exhausted by tyranny and scandal, they may have welcomed a new ruler who promised order without degradation. In this light, the scandal of Nebuchadnezzar's concubines becomes more than a dark chapter of history. It becomes a turning point that shaped the fate of empires. Closing the section. The story of Nebuchadnezzar's concubines is one of rumor and reality, of ritual and exploitation. Whether every detail recorded by outsiders was true is less important than the fact that the world believed it. For centuries, Babylon was remembered not only as a city of gardens and grandeur, but as the stage of humanity's most forbidden practices. And yet, this scandal was only the beginning. For behind every whispered ritual and every silenced concubine lay a deeper struggle. The battle for political dominance waged not on fields of war, but in the secret chambers of desire. As we move forward, the question grows darker. How did these rituals of intimacy fuel the fires of intrigue, betrayal, and political upheaval within Babylon's glittering court? In Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the harem was not only a chamber of desire, but a battlefield of influence. Behind guarded walls, whispers carried as much weight as swords, and the bodies of concubines became weapons in a game of survival. For a ruler obsessed with dominance, the politics of the bedroom often dictated the politics of the empire. Seduction as diplomacy, many of Nebuchadnezzar's concubines were not chosen for beauty alone. They were gifts from noble families or spoils taken from conquered kingdoms. To lie with the king was to tie one's people to Babylon's fate. A concubine from Phoenicia might carry her family's loyalty in her womb. A Judean mistress was both a hostage and a symbol of her people's submission. These women embodied treaties, living contracts sealed in silken blood, betrayals in the inner chambers, but intimacy bred rivalry. Concubines plotted against one another, knowing a single, whispered accusation could alter their fortunes. Some gained influence over the king through seduction, only to fall when jealousy stirred rebellion. Poisonings, secret alliances with eunuchs, and sudden disappearances haunted the palace corridors. For every woman raised to near royal status, another was cast into obscurity or into the grave. Priests and power religion too played its part. The priests of Marduk and Ishtar watched carefully, for the king's bedchamber was as sacred as the temple altar. Some rituals blurred the line between worship and indulgence, granting priests leverage over Nebuchadnezzar's private life. If a concubine bore a child outside sanctioned unions, it became not just a scandal, but a political weapon, threatening dynastic legitimacy. The double-edged sword of desire, sexual intrigue did not only reinforce Nebuchadnezzar's authority, it endangered it. Each concubine represented both loyalty and betrayal, potential queenmaker and assassin. In a world where lineage secured thrones, one night's passion could set dynasties trembling. The king's greatest strength, his control over desire, was also his most dangerous vulnerability. Thus, within the perfumed halls of Babylon, politics was played not only with armies and decrees, but with flesh and whispers. Nebuchadnezzar may have ruled the known world, but in the harem, power shifted with every glance, every secret, every forbidden touch. And as history would soon reveal, such games could unravel empires as surely as war. While Nebuchadnezzar's court overflowed with intrigue and forbidden rituals, the streets of Babylon told a different story. For ordinary men and women, intimacy was bound by law, morality, and the fragile balance of survival. This stark divide between royal excess and common restraint revealed a society shaped by double standards. Marriage and the common home. Babylonian marriage contracts were precise, binding, and often coldly transactional. Clay tablets detail obligations of fidelity, inheritance, and financial duty. A wife was expected to maintain the household and bear legitimate heirs. Adultery, if discovered, could mean death by drowning for both lovers. Desire was not freedom but duty, tightly regulated to protect property and lineage. Slavery and exploitation for slaves, intimacy was even less their own. Enslaved women could be ordered into their master's bed without question, their children, marked by stigma. Sexual exploitation of the powerless was woven into daily life, normalized as part of the social order. In contrast to the gilded harem, these acts went unrecorded, their victims forgotten. Cultural double standards. The palace embodied indulgence sanctified by ritual, while the marketplace enforced rigid codes of honor. Commoners whispered about the scandals of the harem, but such whispers carried danger. To criticize the king was to challenge the gods. Thus, gossip thrived in hushed corners, painting Nebuchadnezzar's private life as both awe-inspiring and monstrous. Gender and power. For women, daily life was a spectrum of confinement and exploitation. Some priestesses enjoyed prestige, serving as intermediaries with the divine. Wives managed households with legal authority. Yet concubines and slaves lived at the mercy of men's desires. The closer a woman stood to power, the more dangerous her position became. In Babylon, sexuality was both sacred and profane, revered in temple carvings, yet policed in alleyways. For the people, it was law-bound and fraught with risk. For the king, it was indulgence wrapped in ritual. This chasm between ruler and ruled left scars on the empire's conscience, scars that would echo long after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Every empire reaches a moment when its splendor begins to rot from within. For Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, that moment arrived not with a clash of armies, but with the slow erosion of faith, morality, and loyalty. The turning point was less a single event than a convergence of scandals, whispers, and religious outrage that cracked the image of divine kingship. Scandal. Behind the gates, by the height of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar's court was infamous for its indulgence. Rituals once seen as sacred performances now appeared as grotesque parodies of faith. When concubines were forced to reenact the union of gods in public ceremonies, what had been holy became mockery. Priests who once sanctified these rites began to question their value. What happens when divine authority is tainted by excess? In the harem, rivalries grew bloodier. Some concubines sought power through their sons, hoping to secure a place in succession. Others, threatened by jealousy, plotted each other's downfall. The court became a crucible of betrayal, and as these scandals multiplied, the people of Babylon began to whisper what no one dared say aloud. Perhaps the king's intimacy with the gods was no blessing, but a curse. The prophetic condemnations. It was in this atmosphere that prophets, among the Judean exiles, raised their voices. In their writings, Babylon became the archetype of corruption, a city drenched in sin, doomed to divine destruction. The Book of Daniel painted Nebuchadnezzar as a ruler humbled by God, stripped of reason, driven mad, until he acknowledged a higher power. Whether allegory or memory, the message was clear. Babylon's pride and excess would not endure. These texts resonated not only with exiles, but with all who had suffered beneath Babylon's weight. They transformed scandal into prophecy, turning private excesses into public warnings of collapse. A fractured legitimacy for Mesopotamian kings, legitimacy rested on two pillars: military might and divine sanction. Nebuchadnezzar had proven himself on the battlefield, but the scandals of the harem and temple eroded the sacred foundation. If the king's union with the goddess was mocked, if his concubines were seen as victims rather than sacred vessels, then the illusion of divine kingship shattered. Priests who once bowed now whispered in dissent. Nobles, resentful of their exclusion from the king's inner sanctum, found reason to question his rule. And ordinary people, burdened by taxes and labor, grew weary of serving a king whose luxuries seemed endless while their lives grew harsher. The human faces of collapse history rarely records the names of concubines, yet their suffering may have played a pivotal role in this unraveling. Imagine the scandal of a concubine who bore a child rumored not to be the king's, or another who dared to seek solace in the arms of a eunuch. Such betrayals, real or fabricated, became weapons in the hands of rivals. Each scandal deepened divisions within the court, creating fractures that no army could mend. Even Nebuchadnezzar himself is said to have felt the weight of these transgressions. Later traditions claim he suffered bouts of madness, living like a beast in the wilderness, stripped of dignity. Whether historical or symbolic, the story reflects the collapse of a ruler consumed by his own excesses. Consequences of unchecked taboos. The turning point, then, was not a single scandal, but the recognition that the palace's taboos had crossed a line. What had once bound the empire together now threatened to tear it apart. The rituals no longer inspired awe, but disgust. The king's harem, once a symbol of dominance, became a breeding ground for fear and treachery. Unchecked indulgence transformed strength into weakness. The very practices that had elevated Nebuchadnezzar above his people now dragged his reputation into the dust. Babylon, the city of gods and gardens, became in the eyes of many a city of decadence and sin. Thus, the seeds of downfall were sown, not by the armies massing beyond the Euphrates, but by the whispers within the palace walls and the cries of those humiliated in its rituals. For when rulers mistake indulgence for power, they invite the judgment of both men and gods. Babylon had reached its turning point, and soon the consequences would come, reshaping not only the fate of an empire, but the memory of Babylon itself, for millennia to come. When Babylon finally fell to Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, the collapse was swift, almost anticlimactic. Ancient sources say the Persians entered the city without resistance, as though the walls themselves had surrendered. To later historians and prophets, this bloodless conquest seemed less a military victory and more a divine judgment, a punishment for the scandals, excesses, and forbidden rites that had consumed Nebuchadnezzar's court. The moral collapse of empire. The palace intrigues and ritualized debauchery had eroded trust. Priests no longer believed in the sacred marriage that once sanctified the king. Nobles had grown weary of being sidelined by a harem wielding influence from behind curtains. Commoners whispered that their king's glory masked corruption. Babylon's foundations were rotting, and Cyrus merely delivered the final blow. To conquered peoples like the Judeans, Babylon's downfall was proof that divine justice could not be outrun. The prophets cast the empire as a warning to all nations. Arrogance, indulgence, and lust led inevitably to ruin. In their writings, Nebuchadnezzar's grandeur became inseparable from scandal, and Babylon itself was immortalized not as a marvel, but as a cautionary tale. The Whore of Babylon. Centuries later, the Christian Book of Revelation crystallized this image. Babylon was reborn as the Whore of Babylon, a symbol of depravity, corruption, and false worship. The image drew directly from stories of harems, temple prostitution, and ritualized sexuality. Whether or not the practices were as widespread as rumors claimed no longer mattered. The scandal had hardened into myth. For Western imagination, Babylon became the ultimate villainous city, wealthy beyond measure, lustful beyond restraint, and doomed beyond redemption. The intimate practices of Nebuchadnezzar's court were magnified into archetypes, shaping moral narratives for centuries. Archaeology and memory modern archaeology has uncovered tablets, reliefs, and palace ruins. But these tell only fragments of the story. We find contracts describing marriage and property. We find references to concubines and harems. Yet the darkest practices, the forced rituals, the humiliations whispered by outsiders, remain elusive. Were they exaggerations by Babylon's enemies or truths buried beneath imperial propaganda? What matters is not only whether they happened, but how they were remembered. Babylon's reputation outlived its empire, staining every retelling with the color of scandal. The sins of Babylon became a metaphor for human corruption itself, echoes in modern times. Even today, the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's court lingers. When scandals erupt among modern rulers, sexual abuse, exploitation, corruption, the comparisons to Babylon return. The palace chambers of ancient Mesopotamia serve as a reminder that intimacy, when entangled with absolute power, can destabilize kingdoms as surely as swords. The consequences of Babylon's taboos were not only immediate, but eternal. They shaped religious imagination, moral philosophy, and the very way history interprets decadence. For every empire that rises, Babylon stands as the warning. Unchecked indulgence corrodes from within, and scandal can outlast even stone. Thus, the legacy of Nebuchadnezzar's sexual politics was written not in his triumphs, but in his downfall. His empire's grandeur crumbled, but its reputation as a city of lust and horror endured for millennia. In the end, the most enduring monument of Babylon was not its gardens or its walls, but its place in history as the world's most infamous city of sin. The story of Nebuchadnezzar II and his concubines is more than a tale of a king's indulgence. It is a window into how power corrupts the most intimate spaces of human life. Babylon's grandeur, the gardens, the gates, the towering ziggurats, was built on discipline, order, and conquest. Yet behind the glittering facade lay chambers of ritual, coercion, and scandal. These hidden practices, whether fully real or partly exaggerated, became the stain that defined Babylon for the ages. Recap of forbidden truths. We have seen how the king wielded sexuality as a weapon of domination, turning concubines into living symbols of conquest. We traced the rivalries and betrayals within the harem, where whispered accusations could decide life or death. We explored the gulf between everyday Babylonians, bound by strict laws of fidelity, and a royal court where excess was sanctified in the name of gods. And we witnessed the turning point, when rituals once celebrated as divine descended into grotesque spectacle, eroding faith and fueling resentment. The fall of Babylon was as much moral as it was military. Scandal and taboo shaped its memory, transforming a mighty city into an eternal cautionary tale. Modern parallels. What makes Babylon's story enduring is its echo in our own age. Today, scandals of power and intimacy still capture headlines. Politicians brought low by secret affairs, religious leaders disgraced by forbidden practices, celebrities exposed for abuses behind closed doors. The patterns remain hauntingly familiar. The palace chambers of Nebuchadnezzar remind us that when intimacy becomes entangled with unchecked authority, the result is not passion, but exploitation, not strength, but ruin. The image of the whore of Babylon, born from whispers of concubines and temple rites, still shapes cultural imagination. It warns of the dangers of lust ungoverned by morality, but also of how societies weaponize scandal to destroy enemies. Just as Judean prophets and Greek historians painted Babylon in lurid colors, so too do modern rivals magnify the private sins of those in power. Unanswered mysteries, yet questions remain. Were Herodotus's tales of temple prostitution accurate, or were they slanders against a fallen foe? Were Nebuchadnezzar's concubines truly forced into public rituals, or were these rumors magnified by exiles and enemies? The archaeological record is fragmentary, leaving us with more speculation than certainty. Perhaps that uncertainty is what gives Babylon its haunting power. It exists both as a historical city and as a mythic symbol, an empire whose true secrets may forever lie buried beneath its ruins. Final reflection. What can we learn from Babylon? That power will always seek to control not only bodies, but desires. That unchecked indulgence corrodes loyalty and erodes legitimacy. And that scandal, once unleashed, can echo through centuries, outlasting armies and monuments alike. So, when we look at the scandals of today, hidden chambers of abuse, secret rituals of the powerful, we are not witnessing anything new. We are seeing the same story replayed, one first told in the shadows of Babylon. And so we leave Nebuchadnezzar's court, its whispers still lingering in the air. Behind the walls of his empire, concubines were turned into instruments, desire was made into ritual, and scandal became destiny. Babylon fell, but its lessons endure. The question remains, what other secrets of ancient empires still lie buried, waiting to be unearthed?